On January 15, 1919, Boston's North End witnessed one of the most unusual industrial disasters in American history, later known as the Great Molasses Flood. The event centered around a massive steel storage tank owned by the Purity Distilling Company, a subsidiary involved in producing industrial alcohol from molasses. This tank, located near Boston Harbor, held over 2.3 million gallons of molasses, a dense syrup used in fermentation processes essential to wartime industry. The tank stood approximately 50 feet tall and 90 feet wide, dominating the busy waterfront district filled with workers, residents, and street traffic. From its construction in 1915, the tank exhibited signs of structural weakness, including audible groans and visible leaks reported by local workers and neighbors. To conceal these leaks, the company routinely painted the tank brown, allowing oozing molasses to blend with the exterior rather than addressing the root cause. Internal company documents later confirmed that the tank was never properly stress tested, a critical step typically performed before filling large industrial vessels. Residents living nearby recalled hearing metallic rumbling sounds days before the disaster, though no corrective action was taken by company officials. On the morning of the flood, temperatures in Boston rose rapidly after a period of cold weather, warming the molasses and reducing its viscosity within the tank. This temperature shift increased internal pressure on the tank's weakened steel panels, already strained by years of improper maintenance and overfilling. At approximately 12:03 p.m., eyewitnesses described a sharp cracking sound, followed by the explosive failure of the tank's curved steel walls. Within seconds, more than 2 million gallons of molasses surged outward, forming a wave estimated at 25 feet high as it swept across the North End. Contemporary reports documented the wave moving at nearly 35 miles per hour, fast enough to overturn vehicles, collapse structures, and trap pedestrians. The force of the molasses destroyed portions of the elevated railway line nearby, forcing steel girders out of alignment and halting rail traffic instantly. Detailed police accounts describe how the wave pressed against buildings with immense weight, crushing wooden frames and flooding basements within seconds. Firefighters stationed at a nearby engine house were caught off guard as the wave burst through the doors, lifting heavy equipment and trapping personnel. Survivors noted that escaping the molasses was extremely difficult due to its density, which created strong suction forces as it spread through the streets. Photographs taken shortly after the event show debris, shattered carts, and damaged structures embedded in thick layers of molasses covering entire city blocks. Initial rescue efforts were hindered by the syrup's heavy consistency, slowing movement and complicating attempts to locate individuals swept beneath the flow. Medical teams documented cases of hypothermia and exhaustion as victims struggled to breathe or move within the slowly solidifying mass across the waterfront. In the hours following the collapse, city personnel, sailors, and police formed improvised rescue teams, working to clear pathways through the hardened syrup. Official reports later stated that the tank's failure was not caused by sabotage, as initially rumored, but by structural flaws and inadequate engineering oversight. Investigators concluded that the steel used in the tank was too thin and lacked essential manganese content, making it brittle under fluctuating temperatures. They also determined that the rivets securing the tank's panels were insufficient, contributing to the catastrophic failure observed that afternoon. This disaster exposed systemic safety failures within industrial operations of the early 20th century, prompting calls for stronger engineering regulations. The Great Molasses Flood became one of the earliest American cases where corporate negligence was proven through scientific and forensic engineering analysis. Its legacy influenced future building codes, industrial storage guidelines, and municipal inspection standards across the United States. In the aftermath of the tank's collapse, emergency response teams struggled to navigate streets coated in a thick layer of molasses up to several feet deep. Rescue workers reported that each step required significant force, as boots became trapped in the sticky mass, slowing every movement across the wreckage. Fire department logs describe how teams used ladders and planks to create makeshift walkways, allowing responders to cross areas where molasses pooled heavily. Horses from delivery wagons were found immobilized, unable to lift their legs from the viscous syrup, with many ultimately succumbing to exhaustion or suffocation. Police officers documented the difficulty of identifying victims due to the dark coloring of the molasses, which coated debris and obscured trapped individuals. Survivors recalled hearing faint cries from beneath collapsed structures, but locating those voices proved challenging as sound carried poorly through the thick syrup. Medical examiners later noted that many fatalities occurred due to asphyxiation, as victims caught in the wave were unable to breathe under its heavy weight. The Boston Elevated Railway immediately suspended service in the area to inspect structural damage caused by the force of the molasses wave against key support beams. Engineers reviewing the site found twisted steel components and displaced rivets along the railway's frame, offering clear evidence of the wave's destructive power. City records show that cleanup operations began within hours, involving firefighters, laborers, and sailors from a nearby naval vessel stationed in Boston Harbor. Workers used high-pressure seawater hoses to break apart hardened molasses, pushing it towards storm drains and eventually back into the harbor. Reports from the Public Works Department described how molasses mixed with sand, dirt, and debris, transforming into a heavy material difficult to remove fully. Cleanup crews reported that the syrup re-liquefied under sunlight each afternoon, slowing progress and requiring repeated washing of the affected areas. Local residents observed that the scent of molasses lingered for months, with newspapers noting that warm weather intensified the odor throughout the North End. Contemporary accounts estimated that several hundred personnel participated in cleanup efforts over multiple weeks, removing tons of debris from city streets. During the investigation, engineers performed metallurgical analyses on recovered steel fragments, revealing brittle failure characteristics under standard testing. These analyses confirmed that the tank's steel walls were significantly thinner than recommended for storing millions of gallons of dense industrial material. Further examination showed that the rivets lacked sufficient tensile strength, contributing to widespread tearing observed along the tank's seams. Court documents later highlighted that Purity Distilling failed to employ certified engineers during the tank's construction, relying instead on unqualified oversight. Evidence presented during litigation demonstrated that the tank leaked consistently from the time it was first filled, signaling fundamental structural weaknesses. Witness testimonies described how children collected leaking molasses from the tank's exterior before the disaster, illustrating the severity of the ongoing leakage. Public scrutiny intensified as investigators uncovered internal company memoranda acknowledging complaints, but deferring repairs due to cost considerations. These findings shifted blame decisively toward corporate negligence rather than environmental conditions or external interference, as initially speculated by some officials. The legal case became one of the largest civil actions of its time, leading to thousands of pages of testimony, expert analysis, and technical documentation. Ultimately, the court ruled that the company bore responsibility for the disaster due to inadequate engineering practices, poor maintenance, and failure to address known defects. The ruling resulted in substantial financial compensation to victims and families, marking a milestone in U.S. industrial liability and public safety enforcement. Historians later recognized the Great Molasses Flood as a catalyst for reform, inspiring stricter building standards and municipal oversight nationwide. In the weeks following the disaster, investigators documented how the force of the molasses wave reshaped Boston's North End, altering streets and damaging foundations. City engineers noted that several brick buildings shifted from their original positions, pushed by the weight and momentum of the syrup as it filled narrow alleys. Photographs taken during cleanup show storefronts tilted at sharp angles, their frames warped by pressure exerted in the initial seconds of the tank's collapse. Railway inspectors recorded misaligned support columns along the elevated track, with steel bent in directions indicating a powerful lateral impact from the wave. Structural assessments confirmed that the molasses carried enough kinetic energy to behave like a fast-moving debris flow, similar to mudslides observed in natural disasters. Eyewitness reports described how the wave swept through nearby stables and warehouses, pulling equipment, crates, and animals into a swirling mass of syrup. Boston newspapers published detailed accounts of responders wading through waist-deep molasses, often cutting through hardened layers to reach trapped survivors. Workers complained that tools became coated in residue within minutes, requiring constant cleaning just to maintain functionality during the rescue operations. Police records indicate that officers patrolled the perimeter for days, preventing residents from entering unstable buildings weakened by saturation and impact. Longshoremen assisting with cleanup noted that molasses seeped into the waterfront, coating piers and creating slick surfaces hazardous for passing workers and cargo. Harbor officials reported that the water near the shoreline turned a deep brown, with residue clinging to mooring posts and floating debris for several days. Environmental observations from the period describe how incoming tides slowly diluted the syrup, carrying it into the outer harbor and dispersing it naturally. Despite concerns about marine impact, officials at the time lacked formal environmental protocols, leaving documentation limited to visual descriptions. As public attention intensified, engineers analyzed fragments of the tank more closely, mapping crack patterns to reconstruct the sequence of structural failure. Their findings showed that the tank ruptured along multiple points simultaneously, indicating widespread weakness rather than a singular point of failure. Metallurgical tests confirmed low manganese content in the steel, contributing to brittleness that worsened under rapid temperature changes experienced that week. Temperature fluctuations caused the molasses inside the tank to expand, increasing hydrostatic pressure against walls already strained by inadequate construction. Company records revealed that the tank was filled to near maximum capacity shortly before the failure, further elevating internal stress against vulnerable seams. Investigators emphasized that basic engineering practices, such as hydrostatic testing, were omitted during construction, leaving the tank unverified under real load. Testimonies presented at later hearings showed that workers reported loud groans and vibrations when the tank was filled. Yet their concerns were dismissed by supervisors. Residents described the tank as a constant presence in the neighborhood, noting that leakage became so common children collected pooling molasses with containers. This normalization of leakage created a perception that the tank's flaws were benign, reducing the urgency for repairs despite visible warning signs. Court proceedings later referenced statements from company officials acknowledging awareness of leaks, but citing financial and operational delays for deferring maintenance. Legal analysts reviewing the case recognized it as one of the earliest examples where forensic engineering evidence played a central role in determining liability. Expert witnesses reconstructed the sequence of events using structural calculations, failure analysis, and material testing to demonstrate systemic negligence. Their testimony countered early rumors of sabotage and emphasized that the collapse was inevitable under existing conditions, not the result of external factors. Boston residents followed court developments closely, as the disaster had become a defining event in the city's early 20th century industrial history. The case marked a turning point in how corporations approached public safety, establishing expectations for engineering standards previously lacking in industrial regulation. As litigation progressed, the court gathered thousands of pages of testimony, technical assessments, and eyewitness statements to reconstruct the disaster accurately. The hearings became one of the longest civil cases in Massachusetts history, reflecting the complexity of engineering evidence and the scale of community impact. Attorneys presented diagrams and structural analyses demonstrating that the tank's steel plates were significantly thinner than standards used in comparable vessels. Material experts testified that the steel lacked proper manganese levels, making it prone to brittle fracture when exposed to sharp temperature fluctuations. These findings aligned with observations that Boston's sudden warm spell caused internal pressures to rise rapidly, stressing the tank far beyond its tolerance. Rivet examinations showed widespread deformation, with many pulled from the steel entirely, indicating insufficient fastening strength during the initial installation. Witnesses from the neighborhood recalled hearing metallic pops moments before the collapse, suggesting the rivets began failing in rapid succession. Investigators concluded that the tank had been a structural failure waiting to occur, with years of overlooked warnings culminating in catastrophic rupture. Company officials attempted to argue that anarchists might have sabotaged the tank, citing political unrest during the era, but the evidence did not support this claim. Forensic analysis found no explosive residue or intentional damage, confirming that the collapse resulted solely from internal stresses and construction deficiencies. Court documents emphasized that the company had filled the tank multiple times without conducting essential safety tests normally required for such large structures. Internal memos revealed that executives were aware of community complaints regarding leaks, but chose to ignore them to avoid costly repairs or operational delays. These disclosures painted a clear picture of corporate negligence, shifting legal responsibility toward the organization's decision-makers rather than external circumstances. The hearings also highlighted evolving views on industrial accountability, demonstrating how engineering evidence could be used to establish liability in civil cases. This approach marked a significant shift from earlier eras, when industrial accidents were often attributed to unavoidable circumstances rather than preventable oversight. Newspaper coverage documented the public's growing demand for regulatory reforms, as residents argued that safety standards must be enforced before similar tragedies occurred. Editorials called for stricter inspection protocols, noting that the disaster exposed gaps in municipal oversight that allowed hazardous infrastructure to remain unchecked. In response, city officials began drafting new guidelines requiring qualified engineers to verify structural integrity before large industrial tanks could be approved. These regulatory changes became a model for future safety codes adopted across the United States, especially in industries involving hazardous materials or storage systems. After months of testimony, the court ruled that the Purity Distilling Company was liable for damages, citing clear evidence of inadequate design and poor maintenance. The company was ordered to compensate victims and affected families, establishing one of the earliest large-scale industrial liability judgments in American legal history. This outcome reinforced the principle that corporations bore responsibility for ensuring public safety when operating large industrial equipment in residential areas. Beyond legal consequences, the disaster prompted nationwide discussions about the importance of engineering precision and proper material selection in industrial construction. Professional engineering societies referenced the case as a critical example of why standardized testing, load calculations, and structural validation were essential safeguards. Historical analyses later recognized the Great Molasses Flood as a turning point that accelerated improvements in industrial regulation and metropolitan planning. The disaster revealed the potential dangers of rapid industrial expansion during the early 20th century, when safety standards had not yet kept pace with technological demands. Researchers studying the event decades later continued to reference its forensic evidence, viewing it as a landmark case in understanding brittle fracture mechanics. Scientific literature cited the tank's failure as an early documented example of structural collapse caused by improper material composition and inadequate design methods. The case remained influential among engineering educators, who used it to illustrate the consequences of neglecting safety testing and relying on unqualified oversight. As the city recovered, residents described how molasses seeped into basements, alleys, and building foundations, leaving a persistent residue that proved difficult to remove. Cleanup crews reported that even after weeks of washing, the syrup clung to brick surfaces and wooden structures, darkening them with a sticky sheen. Workers noted that sunlight softened the hardened molasses each day, causing it to re-liquefy and spread further before cooling again at night. This daily cycle prolonged cleanup efforts and required repeated rinsing using high-pressure seawater pumped directly from Boston Harbor. Harbor officials recorded that the molasses discharge during these cleanings temporarily tinted coastal waters, though tidal movement eventually dispersed the residue. Public Works documents showed that crews transported significant quantities of contaminated sand and debris to designated disposal sites outside the city center. The incident posed challenges not only for physical cleanup, but also for daily activity, as the affected streets remained slippery and hazardous for weeks. Workers described how carts, boots, and tools repeatedly became stuck in the syrup, slowing progress and increasing the labor required for every task. Nearby businesses struggled to resume operations, with owners reporting that molasses had clogged machinery, coated merchandise, and damaged stored inventory. Fire department records note that equipment used in the rescue phase required extensive cleaning and maintenance to remove hardened syrup from mechanical parts. Residents recalled that clothing, furniture, and household belongings remained stained for months, absorbing the molasses' distinct odor long after cleanup ended. Newspaper accounts from the period referenced the persistent smell throughout the North End, describing a sweetness that lingered well into the summer months. Some reports stated that sailors returning to the area years later still claimed they could detect faint traces of molasses when walking near the waterfront. City health officials monitored the neighborhood for potential sanitation issues, though no significant long-term health hazards were documented from the residue. Sanitation teams focused on removing debris trapped beneath the molasses layer, which included broken carts, damaged crates, and collapsed structural elements. Engineers studying the site documented how the molasses infiltrated cracks in pavement and foundations, requiring targeted repairs to prevent future instability. Photographs from the period show teams chiseling away hardened molasses from stone surfaces, illustrating the labor-intensive nature of the cleanup process. Local schools and businesses temporarily closed due to accessibility concerns, as heavy equipment and crews occupied major portions of the affected district. City planners noted that the disaster underscored the need for organized emergency management structures, which were limited at the time. The event highlighted gaps in urban preparedness, demonstrating how industrial accidents could disrupt entire neighborhoods beyond the immediate physical damage. Historical reports referenced the emotional impact on residents, many of whom witnessed the destruction firsthand and assisted in early rescue efforts. Community groups organized relief efforts, providing temporary shelter, food, and clothing to families displaced by property damage or structural collapse. Insurance assessments estimated widespread financial losses, with claims filed for damaged homes, destroyed goods, and lost business operations. Industrial analysts reviewing the disaster recognized the economic ripple effect as cleanup demands placed strain on city resources and local commerce. The magnitude of the response illustrated how a single structural failure could trigger extensive logistical challenges across municipal systems. Researchers later noted that the disaster offered unique insights into fluid dynamics, as the molasses wave behaved similarly to high-density flows observed in geology. Scientists studied how the syrup's viscosity changed under varying temperatures, providing rare real-world observations relevant to industrial material behavior. These analyses contributed to improved understanding of how dense liquids respond under catastrophic release conditions, influencing future engineering standards. Scientific interest in the disaster grew as researchers realized the event offered an unusual opportunity to study non-Newtonian fluid behavior on an urban scale. Molasses, unlike water, does not flow consistently. Its viscosity changes with temperature, causing the flood to behave differently from traditional liquid surges. Engineers examining the event noted that the rapid shift from cold to warm conditions significantly reduced the syrup's thickness just before the collapse occurred. This sudden thinning allowed the molasses to accelerate, generating a fast-moving wave capable of delivering destructive kinetic energy across narrow city streets. As temperatures cooled again, the molasses thickened quickly, trapping victims and debris as the flow solidified around them within minutes of the rupture. These observations later informed studies related to industrial storage materials, highlighting risks associated with temperature-sensitive substances held in large volumes. Researchers emphasized that the behavior of the molasses wave resembled certain geophysical flows, such as volcanic lahars or dense mudslides under specific conditions. This comparison provided new insight into how high-density fluids can transport debris, exert pressure, and cause structural damage even at relatively moderate speeds. Analytical reports published decades later used mathematical modeling to illustrate how the syrup's viscosity contributed to the extreme pressure exerted on buildings. These models demonstrated that molasses carried enough force to move multi-ton structures and compromise foundation stability as it inundated the neighborhood. Contemporary engineers reviewing the case recognized that understanding such fluid dynamics was essential for designing safe industrial storage systems. They argued that companies must account for chemical properties, temperature dependence, and worst-case release scenarios when planning containment structures. The disaster revealed that storage tanks designed without proper engineering oversight posed significant risks not only to industrial sites, but to surrounding communities. As the investigation progressed, city officials consulted with engineering experts to evaluate whether other industrial tanks in Boston required additional inspection. This initiative led to the identification of several aging structures that had not undergone formal testing, prompting new safety assessments across the city. The Molasses Flood demonstrated the importance of municipal regulation, showing how industrial facilities placed in residential districts demanded rigorous oversight. Public interest in engineering safety grew as newspapers covered findings from metallurgical tests, exposing the structural inadequacies that caused the disaster. Editorials urged lawmakers to establish enforceable standards for industrial construction, noting that voluntary compliance had failed to prevent the tragedy. Urban planners highlighted that the North End's dense layout contributed to the severity of the incident, as narrow streets intensified the flow's destructive impact. Crowded residential blocks left little room for the molasses wave to disperse, causing concentrated damage in areas where buildings were tightly spaced. Historical analyses later used the disaster to examine how early 20th century cities struggled to balance industrial expansion with public safety needs. Because zoning regulations were minimal at the time, large storage tanks were often placed near homes, schools, and businesses without comprehensive risk evaluation. The flood exposed the consequences of placing heavy industrial operations within populated districts, influencing future zoning practices across the United States. Legal scholars studying the trial noted that the court's reliance on scientific evidence set an important precedent for future industrial liability cases. Forensic testimony became a crucial factor in identifying root causes, shifting legal decisions from speculation toward fact-based assessments grounded in engineering data. This shift marked a significant step in American jurisprudence, embedding scientific analysis into the legal framework for addressing industrial accidents. The case also contributed to the early development of forensic engineering as a recognized discipline, demonstrating the value of technical expertise in courtroom settings. Historical records show that multiple engineering societies later referenced the disaster in lectures and publications as a cautionary example of design oversight. The Molasses Flood's unique nature ensured its inclusion in discussions about material failures, industrial safety, and risk management for decades to follow. Researchers concluded that the event represented more than a singular tragedy. It illuminated critical gaps in early industrial practices that required systematic reform. By examining the failure mechanisms and environmental factors involved, experts laid the groundwork for future advancements in structural reliability and hazard prevention. As Boston evaluated long-term impacts, city officials documented how the disaster altered the physical and social landscape of the North End for years afterward. Residents displaced by structural damage required temporary housing, and many families faced extended reconstruction timelines due to widespread property destruction. Insurance records from the period show significant financial losses, with claims filed for destroyed goods, collapsed buildings, and business closures caused by contamination. Merchants reported that molasses penetrated storage areas, ruined inventory, and damaged equipment essential for daily operations in the busy waterfront district. City planners noted that the disaster disrupted supply routes, as several key streets remained unusable while crews continued removing hardened syrup and debris. Local businesses faced interruptions that extended far beyond the initial event, highlighting how industrial accidents could exert long-term economic strain on communities. Police logs indicated that officers patrolled the damaged district daily to prevent entry into unstable structures weakened by the force of the molasses wave. Engineers conducted additional inspections on nearby buildings to assess whether foundations had been compromised by the weight and movement of the viscous flow. Their reports described cracking, shifting, and moisture infiltration in several structures, requiring targeted repairs to restore long-term stability and safety. City health officials monitored sanitation concerns as molasses mixed with debris and stagnant water, though no major public health threats were ultimately recorded. Cleanup teams continued washing streets and foundations for months, battling recurring residues that reappeared whenever temperatures rose above seasonal averages. Neighborhood accounts describe how the scent of molasses persisted well into the summer of 1909, becoming a defining sensory memory for residents of the area. Newspaper articles reflected public fascination with the event, documenting every stage of the cleanup and providing updates on legal proceedings against the company. Reporters interviewed survivors, rescue workers, and engineers, piecing together a detailed public narrative built on first-hand experiences and official documentation. This visibility transformed the disaster into a nationally recognized incident, prompting discussions about the need for comprehensive industrial safety standards. Academics examining early 20th century industry noted that the flood underscored weaknesses in regulatory frameworks that had not yet adapted to modernized production. Before the disaster, industrial oversight largely depended on voluntary compliance, leaving significant gaps in structural evaluation, materials testing, and tank inspection. Following the event, Massachusetts implemented reforms requiring licensed engineers to certify the design and construction of large industrial storage tanks. These new requirements mandated stress testing, thorough material evaluation, and adherence to formal engineering principles now common in modern industry. Cities across the United States adopted similar guidelines, recognizing that unchecked industrial growth could pose severe risks to urban populations. Historical analyses contend that the molasses flood played a formative role in shaping early models of municipal zoning, particularly regarding industrial placement. Urban planners argued that potentially hazardous facilities should not be located within densely populated neighborhoods where failure could trigger widespread damage. The disaster brought national attention to the importance of separating industrial infrastructure from residential areas to minimize risks to public safety. Legal scholars reviewing the court case emphasized how the ruling established a foundation for corporate accountability in industrial operations. The decision demonstrated that negligence arising from inadequate testing, ignored warnings, and substandard materials could result in substantial legal and financial consequences. This precedent influenced future litigation involving structural failure, encouraging companies to adopt engineering best practices to avoid liability. The case also became a reference point in academic studies exploring how early industrial disasters shaped American regulatory policy during the 20th century. Public archives contain extensive records from the hearings, offering insight into how forensic engineering helped establish cause and responsibility with scientific clarity. Historians often cite the event as an example of how technological progress, when not matched with proper oversight, can expose communities to preventable disaster. The flood's broader legacy lies in its role as a catalyst for reform, bridging the gap between industrial ambition and the safeguards necessary to protect the public. Through its investigation, the disaster demonstrated how engineering precision, safety protocols, and regulatory vigilance form essential pillars of modern infrastructure. As scholars revisited the disaster decades later, they compiled extensive analyses demonstrating how the flood reshaped understanding of industrial responsibility in America. Historical studies emphasized that the tragedy occurred during a period of rapid industrial expansion when safety protocols lagged behind technological development. Researchers noted that the event became a defining example of how inadequate engineering oversight could lead to catastrophic consequences in densely populated areas. Archival documents highlight that Purity Distilling Company operated with minimal regulatory scrutiny, a common situation for industries prior to stronger federal standards. The tank's failure exposed weaknesses in early 20th century industrial culture, where economic pressures often outweighed investments in structural safety. Legal historians documented the case as a milestone that shifted liability expectations, reinforcing that corporations must protect the public through sound engineering practices. Court transcripts show that expert testimony based on metallurgical evidence proved crucial in determining the exact causes of the rupture and identifying responsible parties. This reliance on scientific expertise marked a turning point in legal proceedings, demonstrating how engineering analysis could guide judicial decisions with measurable clarity. Engineering societies later referenced the case in professional journals, using it to educate future engineers about material selection, stress analysis, and thermal effects. These publications framed the disaster as a lesson in understanding how brittle steel behaves under fluctuating pressures and rapid temperature variations. Academic discussions also explored how the tank's flawed rivets contributed to rapid scene failure, illustrating the importance of quality testing in construction components. The disaster's scientific significance extended beyond structural analysis, offering valuable data on how dense fluids behave when released suddenly under high-pressure conditions. Fluid dynamic studies used the molasses flood to examine wave formation, debris transport, and viscosity changes influenced by environmental temperature shifts. These insights provided useful analogs for understanding hazardous material releases in industrial settings where dense fluids must be carefully managed. Environmental researchers noted that although the harbor temporarily experienced contamination, tidal movements dispersed the molasses without long-term ecological damage. However, municipal records indicate that the cleanup burden strained city resources, demonstrating the economic challenges associated with managing industrial accidents. Public policy experts observed that the disaster influenced early discussions about municipal zoning, reinforcing the need for controlled placement of industrial facilities. Zoning reforms implemented in subsequent years sought to prevent heavy industrial operations from being placed near residential neighborhoods without oversight. The flood's impact on regulatory development became increasingly evident as historians traced parallels between this incident and later industrial safety legislation. These reforms emphasized routine inspection, mandatory engineering certification, and proper documentation for structures capable of posing public risk. The case also encouraged improvements in emergency response planning, highlighting the importance of coordinated efforts between fire departments, public works, and medical teams. Documents from city archives show that Boston updated its emergency protocols following the flood, incorporating strategies to manage large-scale industrial releases. Risk management experts studying the disaster concluded that the event shaped early frameworks for evaluating high-hazard infrastructure across American cities. By demonstrating the systemic failures that contributed to the tragedy, the flood helped establish minimum safety expectations for storage facilities nationwide. Industrial historians consider the Great Molasses Flood one of the most thoroughly investigated accidents of its era, offering extensive forensic data for future research. The wealth of documentation, from courtroom testimony to engineering diagrams, provided a comprehensive record of how the event unfolded and why it occurred. As researchers compared historical accounts with scientific findings, they concluded that the disaster resulted from preventable errors rather than unpredictable environmental forces. This recognition solidified the flood's role as an influential case study, illustrating how human oversight, engineering rigor, and regulatory policy intersect in public safety. The legacy of the molasses flood continues to appear in academic curricula, engineering textbooks, and public safety studies, underscoring its enduring educational value. Through its extensive documentation and far-reaching consequences, the disaster remains a pivotal moment in America's progression toward modern industrial regulation. In the century following the disaster, scholars, engineers, and historians continued examining how the Great Molasses Flood shaped public expectations for industrial safety. Researchers emphasize that the incident provided one of the earliest, thoroughly documented examples of how structural neglect could lead to widespread urban catastrophe. Annual commemorations in Boston now acknowledge the tragedy, highlighting its role in advancing engineering discipline and municipal oversight within modern infrastructure. Local historical organizations preserve artifacts, photographs, and eyewitness accounts, offering the public access to detailed records maintained from the original investigation. Visitors walking through the North End can still identify the former tank site, now integrated into the urban landscape, but marked by interpretive signage. These markers explain how the tank once dominated the waterfront and how its sudden collapse reshaped the neighborhood physically, economically, and socially. The disaster remains a subject of continued academic interest because it demonstrates how engineering failures can expose systemic weaknesses in regulatory frameworks. In lectures and case studies, engineering students analyze the tank's brittle steel, inadequate rivets, and lack of proper stress testing to understand failure mechanisms. They learn how oversight lapses, combined with insufficient materials, can amplify risk when storing large volumes of temperature-sensitive industrial liquids. Industrial safety professionals regularly reference the molasses flood to illustrate the necessity of rigorous testing protocols before commissioning storage structures. Its example reinforces that visual inspection alone cannot guarantee safety. Thorough scientific evaluation must guide decisions involving high-capacity containment. Legal scholars cite the flood in discussions about corporate responsibility, emphasizing how the court's ruling defined new standards for liability in industrial operations. The decision underscored that companies must prioritize structural integrity and compliance rather than cost-saving measures that compromise public welfare. Historians highlight how the event influenced early 20th century urban planning, prompting cities to reevaluate zoning policies and industrial proximity to homes. These reforms led to safer urban environments, better equipped to manage risks associated with expanding manufacturing and storage facilities. Environmental scientists reviewing the event note that although long-term ecological impacts were minimal, the flood illustrated how sudden material releases strain city resources. The cleanup operation offered lessons in environmental response that later informed protocols for handling industrial spills involving dense or hazardous substances. Public memory of the disaster endured partly because of its unusual nature, as few industrial incidents involved a material as unexpected as molasses causing such destruction. Newspapers from the era described the event with a mixture of shock and disbelief, capturing attention nationwide due to the flood's extraordinary characteristics. Modern retellings emphasize that behind the unusual substance lay a serious failure of engineering and corporate responsibility that cost lives and devastated a community. Documentation shows that 21 people died and more than 150 were injured, numbers that underscore the gravity of the event beyond its unusual medium. Families affected by the disaster faced lasting emotional and financial consequences, contributing to the demand for stricter oversight and legal accountability. These demands resonated with lawmakers, shaping future regulations governing industrial construction, material testing, and municipal approval processes. Researchers studying American industrial history view the molasses flood as a critical inflection point, an event that accelerated the nation's movement toward modern safety standards. Without its extensive investigation and legal proceedings, reforms in engineering certification and structural evaluation may have progressed at a slower pace. The disaster's contribution to forensic engineering is particularly significant, as it demonstrated how scientific analysis could uncover precise failure causes in complex incidents. This methodological approach has since become foundational in industrial accident investigations, guiding engineers in preventing similar structural collapses. Today, the Great Molasses Flood stands as both a historical curiosity and a solemn reminder of the consequences that arise when engineering rigor is overlooked. Its legacy continues to inform discussions on risk mitigation, infrastructure design, and public protection across industries handling large-scale storage systems. Through comprehensive documentation and far-reaching impact, the disaster endures as a powerful case study illustrating the essential balance between innovation and safety. More than a century after the Great Molasses Flood, the event continues to stand as a defining example of how industrial negligence can cascade into a full-scale urban disaster with long-lasting consequences. Its detailed documentation, spanning engineering reports, court transcripts, photographs, and survivor accounts, allows modern researchers to reconstruct the sequence of failures with clarity unmatched by many early 20th century incidents. This transparency transformed the flood into a foundational case study, demonstrating how brittle materials, insufficient testing, and ignored warning signs created conditions for a collapse that was both preventable and devastating. The disaster's impact extended far beyond Boston's North End, influencing national debates about industrial accountability at a time when regulatory frameworks remained limited and inconsistently enforced. As lawmakers reviewed the findings, they recognized the urgent need for building codes requiring verified engineering oversight, standardized stress testing, and documented safety evaluations before large storage structures could operate near civilian populations. These reforms represented a shift in public attitudes, acknowledging that industrial growth could not come at the expense of safety. and that scientific evidence must guide decisions involving infrastructure with potential for widespread harm. Engineering societies later cited the molasses flood in lectures and publications, using it to emphasize the importance of material quality, rivet integrity, and the effects of thermal stress on steel structures subjected to fluctuating temperatures. The event also contributed to the emerging field of forensic engineering, illustrating how methodical examination of fracture patterns, material composition, and failure points could uncover the underlying mechanics of structural collapse. Modern safety policies owe part of their foundation to the hard lessons drawn from the tragedy, which demonstrated how a single poorly built tank could expose thousands of residents to life-threatening danger in a matter of seconds. Today, the former site bears no visible scars of the disaster, but historical markers remind visitors that the quiet streets once witnessed a wave, powerful enough to move buildings, twist steel, and reshape an entire neighborhood's history. For Boston, the flood remains a symbol of community resilience and a testament to the necessity of oversight in an era when industrial operations continue to expand in scale and complexity. For engineers and policymakers, it remains a cautionary benchmark illustrating that safety must be intentional, not assumed, and that every structure bearing public risk must meet standards grounded in evidence, not convenience. And, for historians, the event endures as one of the clearest examples of how a tragedy can produce lasting reform, ensuring that future generations benefit from safeguards created in response to a moment of profound loss.